been reading and teaching science fiction for a long time, and it's kind of how I got into this business because I was the sci-fi nerd in high school that always had the sci-fi novel for reading in study halls. Remember those days? And I could care less if people thought I was a geek or not. I was the bad kind of unacceptable geek. But that's how I kind of get into this. I loved reading so much, and particularly loved, how many of us have spent countless hours in like a Barnes & Noble just staring at the sci-fi books? I mean, come on, right?
Yep.
Just looking at the covers and going, that's awesome, great. And at one point, this was when Walden Books was still in business. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I had this deal because there was this one worker at this local Walden Books who would occasionally like rip off the cover of a book, because you know how that works?
The
Remainders.
Right,
Yeah.
remainder would rip off a cover for me so that I could have the book, because I was dirt poor, I had no money, and that they would get the reimbursement from the cover from the publishers, and I would get the book. I mean, we didn't do that often because technically that would be illegal, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But by golly, I am who I am today.
You are a fine, upstanding citizen, Eric.
Not really, but
You look
I try
like
to
one.
be on occasion, you know.
You pretend well.
So at any rate, I've loved it my entire life and got away from it a little bit when I was working on my graduate degree and stuff like that, and developed my research specialty in 19th century American. But then when I became a professor and started teaching, I developed a science fiction course and got it on the books, and I've been teaching it ever since.
Casey here, Susan here. I'm a sophomore. Officially, I'm a double major in economics and English, but I mostly do self-study. I try to avoid as much just like regular classwork as I can, and follow along my own path, read things like systems theory, consciousness explained, Paul Krugman's Thinking Fast and Slow, stuff like that, supplemented with film research. Like I just watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington like 2 days ago on Google Video, just because there's a huge history of film in the last 100 years or so. And so I try to make sure I inculturate myself with stuff like that. So I try to absorb all sorts of different forms of medium. When I was in 8th grade, I read the Wheel of Time series, which most of y'all probably know is huge, and I read it in 8th grade, the whole thing. At least what was released up to that point, except for I think the very last book, because at that point the story was trailing off terribly and I had to quit. Yeah, I've always been an avid reader, also a big fan of George R.R. Martin, his Song of Ice and Fire. So I'm more of a fantasy person when it comes to literature, but I've still read the Ender's Game and Dune and some of the more well-known sci-fi.
Excellent.
Melissa Skipper, I work over at the Central Library in collection development, and one of the areas I get to order is the science fiction.
Yay!
So,
Awesome. Well, we're glad you're here.
Linda Dinwiddie
Yeah.
had one of the flyers and forwarded it to me, since I
Oh, good.
am very interested in science fiction myself, so I was thrilled to get
Great.
it.
Oh, well, we're glad you're here. Nice.
I am John Miles. I'm assistant professor and in that field known mainly for science fiction, early American and colonial American
Right.
studies. So Mary Rawlinson's captivity narrative, which we all know, was originally intended to be a part of a collection by Increase Mather about remarkable scientific providences, comets, earthquakes, such as that.
I'm actually a freshly minted ABD. I just did everything. Yes, I'm pretty happy with that. And whereas Dr. Link kind of faked it, kind of like, oh, I'm going to get a respectable degree. Like he's 19th century American realism naturally with that. I just said, you know what, I'm going to do 19th century science fiction because I'm a little insane. That's fine though, right? And so yeah, I do mostly kind of Victorian and post-Victorian sci-fi, fantasy, horror, you know. That's all that stuff kind of started to look the same way that we think it looks like now, so it's kind of easy to do. I'm cheating a little. And I thought I would let someone know, this isn't exactly a biographical introduction, but it is very appropriate that we're meeting today, not because of the first day of spring, but because it is International Talk Like William Shatner Day. I am
No
not
way.
joking, because it is the Shatner's birthday
I
today.
thought you were going to go with Lovecraft's birthday,
goodness.
but you
No, that is August the 20th.
Today is his.
Okay.
It's March. It's March.
Geeking out.
Oh,
But yes,
Yeah,
Shatner.
don't worry, I don't get into
that's
it.
awesome.
Yep.
I know.
So I will encourage the panelists not to try to imitate Shatner the entire time. But if you'd like to do it once, it's okay.
Nice.
And that's really it for me. I'm just kind of here to make sure things get from beginning to end. That's all my job is. So now our panelists.
My name is Wilson Viar. I'm a doctoral candidate slating away on my dissertation. I'm concentrating on slave narratives gathered by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. Thanks to Dr. Link's senior class in science fiction, I discovered that I didn't have to keep in the closet any longer, and discovered Afrofuturism. And since then, it's been one of the biggest obstacles in the way of finishing my dissertation. All this new stuff to explore.
My name is Geoffrey Emerson. I just finished my master's degree here at the University of Memphis, and I'm actually mainly in early modern studies, so usually a long way away. However, I am deeply interested in the history and philosophy of science and its effect on literary texts and things like that, and specifically how it affected identity and identity construction. So that's how I found my way into this room today.
I'm Dr. Shelby Crosby. I'm an assistant professor here. My focus is in 19th century African American literature. However, in graduate school, I had a wonderful professor introduce me to Octavia Butler. And let's just say I fell in love and spent one whole winter break reading everything she had ever written and eagerly awaiting more, and then she passed away and I cried. So that was my introduction to science fiction, and then it's just expanded from there. Unlike many people here, I don't have the traditional sci-fi background. I don't like Star Trek. I don't care for most of that type of science fiction, but I have fallen in love with, and I guess this is why I'm on the panel, I have fallen in love with Afro-futurism and really African diasporic. And you know, I brought a couple of books to kind of just pass around in that vein. Collections that talk about the role of African, and I wouldn't say African American, I would say African diaspora, African diasporic writer in the science fiction and what has now been speculative fiction genre. And I look forward to an interesting conversation, and I'll pass these around for people to take a look at.
That's where we get started. Dr. Crosby. I noticed in the first of those that there's a story about Mary Baraka. Do you have any idea how you would feel about being classed as science fiction?
Well, I'm assuming he allowed it to be
You had to
part
be
of it.
permission.
But I think that what we're seeing is a recasting of fairly traditional, what's considered traditional canonical African American texts, because, and it really speaks to one of the questions that Greg sent us, so I'll just kind of spring into that. One of the questions he sent us was, for a long time the science fiction market excluded African American writers, but African American writers also seem to avoid science fiction, despite supposed similarities between sci-fi and AFAN. Why aren't there more African American science fiction writers, especially as the genre supposedly makes it easier to examine the status of the outsider or the dystopic society? I had a couple of responses when I read that question. One, I think it depends on what we think science fiction is and if it's a easily categorized and definite space. Two, when we're talking about especially early publication, we would be not talking about African Americans not wanting to participate but not being able to be published.
Allowed.
Yeah. And I think particularly about this because I'm working on an essay on Hurston right now, and she has an essay called What White Publishers Won't Print. And I think that that would be something that we could see. For example, in Dark Matter, they've collected a Du Bois story from 1920, right? There's no way that he could have classified that under science fiction, and that wouldn't have been what he wanted anyway, right? As part of his racial uplift and social programs, he wanted to be in that African American camp. But what I think African American writers do, and this is probably across the board, I can think of Native American writers who do this, they borrow from other traditions to further their political goals or even just their artistic goals. And I think that's what we see a lot of in African American literature. So I'm thinking of Beloved, right? Toni Morrison wouldn't say that's science fiction, but there's aspects that we can see there. So the magical realism, right, really kind of rides that line, and we can begin to think about that as speculative fiction. A contemporary sci-fi writer that would say this, and I think she classifies herself as spec fiction, would be Nayla Hopkinson. Latest book, The Salt Roads, and it's very much in line with magical realism, science fiction. So you can see, I think, that they blur those boundaries, and that's one of the reasons, I think, the limitations of publication at the beginning. And then by the time there was publication, we see them integrate into other forms. And, you know, frankly, color lines are defined and set in stone for most of the 20th century. So that was my kind of reaction. I do think it's a wonderful genre in terms of thinking of the status of the outsider in the dystopic society. And when you look at Dark Matter and even this one, you're going to see that they're recasting a number of those authors. And Dr. Link gave me an essay from Sci-Fi, I can't remember, Science Fiction Quarterly Studies that actually does that with Martin Delaney. They look at these 19th century authors and try to rethink them or kind of reopen their case and think about it as science fiction.
Also wondered, and I looked for and couldn't find the kind of African American specific hissing of science fiction, the genre fiction. Got different reactions from people about sort of the social positives it goes in, the Harlem Renaissance and the Black Arts movement, that it has to be political, has to do certain things.
I think it's a tough sell, particularly during those times for the Black reading public, because they saw science fiction as escapism, right? And one of the, there's a wonderful interview with Butler where they said, well, why should Black people read science fiction? And then she said, well, why shouldn't they, right? It expands their scope, it allows them to think outside of the current situation, so it allows them to see it more objectively, because we're not saying, well, Black people did this and white people did that, we're taking it out of that language. So I think while it does allow that, within the Black community, in the Black reading public, they think it's suspect, right? Science fiction is Star Trek. Science fiction isn't Black people.
Along the lines of that kind of appropriation, I did investigate African American fiction and the Gothic, which is where the science fiction is said to have kind of originated. And you know, my investigation kind of focused on Native Soul. Richard Wright just kind of wholesale appropriated Gothic imagery, but in no way would I actually classify that as a straight Gothic novel. Because that would imply some sort of maybe supernatural or something, or some other type of activation. I think that that would, in some way, self-defeat or be self-defeating to the experience that Richard Wright was trying to convey with that kind of narrative.
Well, we can see that again with Invisible Man in 1952, Ralph Ellison, right? They're reevaluating it now, and he's becoming, in terms of criticism, people are beginning to talk about the sci-fi conventions within the text, but I'm pretty sure Ellison wouldn't classify that as science fiction. But in that text, he's borrowing from a number of traditions and genres to kind of elucidate his point about race and existence in America. So I think science fiction becomes useful for the African American writer.
Robert commented on somebody, Black author who did a book that's sort of dry comedic and told them it was a waste of a fine young Black author's mind.
Baraka would say that.
Yeah, said that. And I wonder if, I just keep wondering how much of the bad rep that sci-fi has had traditionally as escapism, or as like it doesn't have elves and fairies in it, but it's got little green things, which is various stuff. Or whether, or how much is there really today a survival of the you must be political, you must confront race directly on like board and I shouldn't do it.
I don't think that that's necessarily the contemporary perception at this point. I think people are still want to explore it, but when you talk about directly, you're talking particularly, I think, of a political moment in the country. Right now, you would read someone like Colson Whitehead, right? So he's talking about race, but he's also kind of using a postmodern aesthetic, right? So he has John Henry days, but he's exploring something outside of John Henry, working himself to death and falling to his, falling and dying, right? He's not being oblique or obvious with it. So I think there's a different way in which, and this is totally not my field, right? I read it, but it's not my critical field. So I think it's a little different. But I think we also see, when you talk about slave narratives of the 30s, we're seeing neo-slave narratives still coming out that look at race in a different way. Wench, for example, just came out a year ago. And she's looking at slavery, but she's also talking about a different kind of slavery. She's talking about those women who went on vacations with their masters/lovers. She's talking about a very different form. She's not saying everybody was out in the fields being beaten and picking cotton. So I think that because we have distance and because we've had that first wave of that, we are looking at the minutiae within the Black community, right? And this is authors across the board who are doing this. This isn't just particular Black people, right? Anyone can write about slavery. It's an American experience.
There's two people I used trying to make effort features on movement, more like Renaissance. They were both very straight out of Black arts movement. And I wasn't reading anybody else except in response to them who was talking like that.
I don't think that you will. Hopkinson definitely doesn't have that perspective. If anything, we see her really developing an African diasporic sense, right? So it's not an American, just a Black American experience. It's about that diasporic community. Tanner Udu is taking us back to Africa, right? Talking about an immortal tribe of Africans in My Soul to Keep, right? So she's going back to something else. And there's a great interview in Dark Matter where they talk about their inspirations and what they see their work doing. And part of what I think is interesting is that they say that they're trying to deal with the end, right? Like their death, right? So you write in order to understand it, you write in order to defy it, you write in order to expand. And I think that for them, that's a lot of it, and that might be a way out of dealing with racism in some ways, right? To make sense of the thing that makes no sense. Whereas Baraka's like, no, right? The Black arts movement is this, poetry and art needs to be a gun or it's useless, and if you do anything else, then you're a traitor.
Well, I guess I can pose the same question now. Let me see. I'm trying to decide now which one the best one.
I went out of order, I apologize.
That's perfectly fine because that's a really good way to start. That was better than the way I was going to start. I appreciate it. But now I've got to kind of, I guess I'll take one, the question is simpler. I would just ask if what you think of how science fiction particularly, and this might imply more traditional science fiction, the stuff that you were talking about is kind of more canonical science fiction, but can a genre of literature, so stuff that's within that mold, how does that stuff work with issues of race, ethnic, gender experiences, all the kind of minority experiences, given that they generally tend to use kind of fictionalization of the stuff themselves, like they estrange you. And I have an example if that's sort of weird. The X-Men, right? Everyone kind of knows who the X-Men are. Those stories, avowedly by the original author, are about racism, right? About how could you possibly hate someone because they're different from you, except he made them also superheroes, so he gave them powers. That's sort of what science fiction does, right? It comes with something crazy that can't happen in the real world and tries to discuss a real world issue. What kind of implications do you think that has for discussing the experience of someone, a kind of oppressed group like that, like the X-Men. Or whatever example you'd like to use.
Well, you know, I think I would kind of default back to the escapism that we were talking about before, because I think generating, you know, in a sense, what science fiction does is it generates distance from the social real or the actual world. And that kind of distance is a little, you know, dangerous is the only word that's coming to mind, but that one doesn't feel satisfying at all. But it, because there's going to be, once you try and reconnect with the social real, or you know, you try and turn then from your vantage point outside of society and examine it, you are inevitably going to run up against slippage and kind of a misrepresentation of the experience that you're trying to examine. You know, saying, you know, is the X-Men experience really an accurate analogy for what's going on in terms of like the minority experience, or you know, different gender or sexuality experiences. So I think that's the direction that I would like. You know, there might be slippage in terms of trying to connect.
Science fiction also tends to, however, not too much misdirection, but it's dealing with concepts and relationships. They're generalized out.
Abstractions, maybe?
Yes, and so I worry less. I think that distance is empowering. I can see it being misperceived as not an insult, but a slighting of to the horrors of slavery, or lynching, everything.
Well, I guess my question would be empowering for who?
For those trying to understand kind of how the hell did we get here? Kind of what Germany's still asking itself. I've talked to German tourists who just, you can tell I finally had to ask, pretty scared when I asked about the 30s and 40s. And so that distance first gives you emotional distance. It also gives you a greater ability to perceive patterns that are so, that we're so used to, that have sunk into the gestalt, that it kind of gives that contrast by adding the difference. So it's, then it was intellectually empowered, and then to whatever extent greater understanding is individually or socially empowered. But the intellectual empowerment, the increase in the ability to perceive is maybe that's what.
I guess I wonder about audience, and this is just musing, it's not, I have no formed kind of sense of it. I wonder about audience when we're talking about diversity, particularly with a canonical kind of, and I'm thinking like Ray Bradbury, right? Who I love, but who was reading that? I'm thinking about, and more, did they want that distance? Did they see the author's intent, perhaps, when they were constructing the story about diversity? And is that a word that would even have been used, right? So I guess I wonder just kind of about that relationship. And like I said, I have no answers, but I do think that it is a powerful space for commentary, but I wonder about readers' perception and the commentary that they want to produce. You know, when you read interviews with these authors, they talk about it being an open space for them that they could see, not that they saw diversity in reading Ray Bradbury,
right,
but that they saw that they themselves could write something that related to their experience.
I guess a follow-up to that, though, I'll throw at you guys then, is what you made me think of is what I've read in Samuel Delaney, talking about science fiction is actually a different way of reading, that it's sort of maybe not bad. It's maybe is a bad idea to call it a genre. It's actually a method for the reader as well as the writer. And so, I guess is that what you think might be happening there? That they're adopting the method?
Yeah, I think it is.
And what do you think the method is? Do you have any thoughts on that?
And by they, you mean the
readers,
advent.
the second generation writers, third generation writers.
I think they are adopting the conventions, and then kind of it becomes an amalgamation, right? Of the science fiction conventions, and then their lived realities, or the things that they want to write themselves out of, right? So Delaney wants to talk about that third sex, that you know, that space of you know, not homosexuality and heterosexuality. So he begins that. Butler does that with Lilith's Brood or the Exogenesis series, where you have to have an Uli in order to create that experience. So I think that it's about kind of expressing or imagining a way out of whatever their lived situation is.
Okay.
I think. I could be
Sounds pretty
completely
good,
wrong, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just reading a little bit before this, to have this conversation. Jules Gomez talks about, because she wrote, and I don't know if you are all familiar with the Gilda stories. It's this wonderful novel that follows the life of a black lesbian vampire from 1815 to 2015. Right, and you see her development. And she wanted to explore the vampire myth, but she said, you know, when she started getting rejection letters, the one thing that they kept saying, she said the subtext was that part of who I was being rejected, right? Black, woman, and lesbian, right? So I think part of that too was kind of, that was her biggest thing. She was like, you know, they're rejecting not just my story, my novel, but part of who I am. And I think that was one of the things she was exploring, like, what does this all mean, right? And if you have not read it, you absolutely should. It is wonderful. Although the 2015 section she could have left off with. Which I have that on good authority. My mentor was a friend of hers who was reading it, and she was like, I told her just to read that last section off. She didn't listen to me. And now it's a classic.
Who knows, huh?
Yeah, you never know what's going to work.
Okay. Let's see here. Geoffrey mentioned in his introduction that he's really interested in how science fiction works with identity. So I thought I'd start by asking him this one directly. Is there a particular way that science fiction tends to talk about identity? Is there a pattern to it, or does it just tend to, and given our topic, what does that imply to people trying to deal with their experiences in their lives, trying to work through them, like we were just talking about?
My first response to that is going to go directly for that word pattern, and I think that science fiction is interesting, if for no other reason, because the answer to that is no. And because it is such a kind of a freeing moment in terms of, you know, anything that you could possibly, come up with, you can do that, or you can kind of produce that. However, the construction of identity is, kind of shaped, I think, by either some sort of social collective experience or by the author's kind of experience, and trying to kind of convey that to the reader and allow another thing that we were kind of going into, like almost a reader response. It's as much a method of writing as it is reading, and I think on that level, a reader being able to participate and kind of generate identity for and kind of with any characters that they may encounter is almost it's a completely blank slate inside science fiction.
And I mean, the idea of identity, though, is so difficult to begin with. Any idea of construction of identity or a solid identity, because it's always a slippage, right? Because when the last question he has is about the cyborg. and hodgepodge identities. And hodgepodge was the word that stuck with me, and I
Actually,
wasn't.
Pete wrote that word out,
Yeah,
but you can talk about that if you want.
well, because I got it and I was like, well, what does he mean by hodgepodge identities? And then he says, can the figure tell us anything about minority identities? I'm like, so then are you saying that minority identities are hodgepodge?
Yeah, that's the
Right?
reason I
That's why
edited
you
it, because I didn't mean to imply that. Right.
I figured you would edit it out by the time we got here.
But
I
it's
thought it was
interesting that that's how my language works anyway, isn't
yeah,
it?
well, and it's interesting to think about it because the fact that Du Bois is writing science fiction when he's also coining the idea of double consciousness, right? The idea that this identity is really about a reconciliation. So, and we can apply that out, right? This reconciliation, can this be reconciled, and does it need to be reconciled? And I think that in that way, maybe the cyborg is useful, but it's interesting because it also, does it take away from the humanity in that identity? What was my question?
Yeah.
And does that matter, right? In science fiction, does that, and this is a question to all of you, I guess we're only talking to each other right now, but it would be a question to everyone. Where's the humanity in this, or is that a significant part of the science fiction, either methodology or reading experience or writing experience? Or we just, yeah, I'm gonna stop.
I kind of have always thought the science fiction is more about the other and othering, even having construction of an other reality. But it does so in ways that, I'll just bring Star Trek in again.
I may not get the reference.
One of the obsessions of some of their weakest episodes was trying to separate humanity or humaneness from solely human beings. And they always kept it ephemeral, sort of an exploration. That seems to be one of the common themes in the science fiction I like best, is that the character identities are defined both by their otherness from us, and then within the worlds they live, just like in our reality, comparison, contrast. They are themselves through their differences or similarities to the people in their world, and our reflection on that in ours. It's kind of the getting
That
back
was
to
lovely.
this. Sometimes I freestyle the part. So I
Stop admitting that.
yes. My reaction to the question was that, in a real general way, extremely general, that you could say yes, that construction through othering, but the more specific you get about any book or author or style, the more it speeds towards no, for the reasons that he gave. But you come up with more or less all the things in African-American fiction or other fiction for creating identity, where visual animals sell appearances, especially with aliens. It's always that visual description first. And social empowerment or disempowerment, power relationships, sort of the hegemonic ideology of wherever they're living and their relationship to that, are they inside or outside ideologically as well in terms of power. And sort of one of the things I love about Butler is there are no good guys or bad guys. And that's something that almost all fiction has great difficulty escaping from, is iconic figures. The Harkonnens and the treaties.
How does she do that for you?
I think her characters are more intensely human than just about any others I've read, because humans can't be the icons we want them to be in fiction. And they change over time in response to environment. So mistakes happen.
Well, and I think that goes back to her idea that in terms of hierarchy, that's our tragic flaw. right, as human beings. So no one can be perfect because we're all really kind of striving to be on top.
So I've always thought that because of the other stress in creation and science fiction, it allows that. You've got more room and tools to work with and a greater potential for escape from sort of the good guys, bad guys in between. Even creep, I was going to bring up Jim. It's a nobility structure, so there's got to be the bad nobles and the good nobles.
But maybe that goes back to why Black writers weren't publishing actively in the science fiction genre, because they saw a good guy and a bad guy, and they did not want to necessarily write themselves out of that. They wanted to expose the superstructure, right, and try to demand change. So when we're talking particularly naturalism, right, that they saw a definite bad guy, and it wasn't them, right? So I think that Wright in particular, he wouldn't want to write himself out of that. He wanted to show how Bigger Thomas came into being, right? So maybe that goes back to why they weren't participating fully in that field. Not even necessarily they couldn't get published, but because
that was true as well.
that they didn't believe it.
I wonder too, sort of return the point to, blacks were left out of the Industrial Revolution. Gil Scott Heron's Whitey on the Captured the idea of
All right, we're going to Gil Scott Heron.
Yeah,
Nice.
not just flower power is doing nothing for urban life, but they're left out of the new industrial revolution, the Grand Man. That's so much of what science fiction has been about in a lot of ways.
Well, and even the term Afrofuturism, right? They're trying to insert themselves into that ideology. And so much of what you read isn't science, it's not literature, it's also often like technology stuff when you talk about Afrofuturism. Cyber world. Geoffrey, you were going to say something?
Just in the sense that, like, kind of with that estrangement from the genre itself in publishing, the one thing that kind of struck me when I was preparing for this was a moment in Heinlein's Starship Troopers, when you finally get a description of the main character and you find he's very mixed race, and it seems to all of a sudden imply, and this is actually, if I'm not mistaken, kind of towards the end of the book, like 2/3 of the way in or something like that, seems to imply this like kind of post-racial thing, or like future, which is laudable in some ways, but it also kind of, in a sense, skips over the minority experience. And in what ways can you then import the values in minority experience into a future like that? Because it's in as much as it is kind of acknowledging that problem, it is also in some sense kind of dealing with it unsatisfactorily, or kind of feels almost dismissive. But that's being a little bit.
I'll take just a second to step outside the moderator to add to that as well.
Absolutely.
Because you made me think of it. I've never thought of it before. I know what you're talking about in Starship Troopers as well. Somehow you just made me remember that book is about a totalitarian world state, which is really important to the fact that he's glossing over the experience of how we get over racism. Because how we got over racism is we had the bugs. There was another other that was more dangerous than anyone else.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's actually kind of in the book, but it's one of his juvenile books, and so he just didn't talk about it.
Right.
Because I've always wondered, like, whether Heinlein is a super genius or not. He's smarter than that would imply what you're talking about. So I always wondered too. Okay. I'll also take this opportunity to say that the H word that I was striving for in the first draft was hybrid identities.
Not Hodge.
Yes. Because I was thinking specifically about the Cyborg Manifesto, the feminist work on, so that's sort of what I was trying to do. All right.
Hybrid though opens up a whole
Which I
other
intended to do,
can
exactly.
of words.
And in fact, my own opinion is everyone's identity is hybrid identity, but if you're part of the social hegemon, you have the illusion that it's a unified identity.
Absolutely, but when you talk about hybridity, that also takes us to that diaspora community, and particularly we're talking in the Caribbean, which is where a lot of the people in Throwing the Bones actually land. And most of them are coming out of that space, or they're transplants who were Jamaican born but now live in Canada. So Haiti born but now living in New York. So I think that when we talk about hybridity, it's such a, I don't know. It's
why I wanted to
really
ask about
complicated, really fast. Well, in what context? Do you think science fiction is hybrid? Are you talking about the construction of identity is hybrid within science fiction?
Well, you can talk about whichever one you find most interesting. But I actually sort of meant both, because historically it is kind of a hybrid literature. Someone mentioned earlier borrows from the Gothic, Geoffrey, I think you mentioned. But it's also just borrowing from rhetoric of science, all so on and so forth. I'm not going to. But it's also. Give me just a second. Yeah, it also, I think, does. This is why I asked if there was a pattern. I do agree with you, but I think it might be slightly more consistent in it that they construct identity as a hybrid in science fiction than outside it.
Why do they need to do that, though?
I'm not
What's
sure
your
why,
guess?
but I
For
think
your
it's because it's
educated
been a
response.
para-literature for so long.
Mhm.
It's not been respectable. Now I'm answering the questions.
Yes,
The panel's
I've
asking.
turned it around.
That's fine. That's okay. I would say it's because since it was a para-literature, everyone writing it was writing and trying to make the best things they could, right? And so they feel the same as any other writer. They feel the same as Richard Wright, or I'm trying to come up with an example like Tony Faulkner. They feel the same as those people, but they're informed by their society that you're not the same, but they're doing, well, I wrote a book too. And so it's as though there's almost something endemic in traditional science fiction that forces you to view identity as something hybrid because you've had to fill different roles just to get to the point where you've written a science fiction film. And that's how I'll make it back to the panel. Do you think that tracks and makes sense, or do you think something else is going on there?
It does, but then that takes diversity out of the question then,
Which
or out of
is
the
problem,
equation.
right?
Because then they're talking not about diversity, they're talking about their own sense of marginalization,
Yeah.
which is really different than talking about diversity in terms of the hybrid.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have an answer otherwise,
Uh-huh.
but that would just be the comment I have.
Yeah, I was actually reading an article on the kind of general feeling of the literary world in kind of Latin America about science fiction and how they feel. And most of the popular authors that we kind of gravitate towards would probably be classified as magical realism. The most famous of which is, 100 Years of Solitude and something like that, where there are magic carpets flying by the window, and then there's the main character at the time is, of course, obsessed with a really large magnifying glass, which doesn't seem magical at all to us. Kind of confusing. But at the same time, there is kind of and this goes back to, I guess, what I was saying before, where there's this kind of gritty closeness with reality, and that gives them the opportunity to examine real life. I mean, 100 Years of Solitude actually does investigate some oppression that was going on that they were really, or that he kind of portrays in that novel. And in that sense, you can really explore the process of that 100 years and stuff like that. So, I forgot what I was going. But the feelings of kind of the Latin American literary community were kind of traditionally or initially distant from science fiction because of kind of an assumption on their part of cultural imperialism and things like that. And that is, I think, worthy concern whenever kind of considering science fiction, because there are Down Below Station, one book that we read for the Science Fiction Collective had several moments of like kind of the kind of indigenous aliens being kind of filling willingly the role of I don't know, servitude or like kind of being subservient and stuff like that, which is kind of just, you know, and there was no satisfying answer to address like what was going on there. And so I think that those kind of concerns about cultural imperialism are definitely warrant a large degree of kind of contemplation.
Well, and I think when we see those Caribbean writers who are doing science fiction now, they are dealing with that cultural imperialism. They are kind of trying to think about that power structure, and not in a like they're above, they're below. It's more of a continuation, right? So they're not looking at, for example, the salt rooms. Yeah, part of it is set in the Caribbean, but another part of it is about Baudelaire's mulatto mistress, right? And another part takes us to ancient Egypt, right? So she's building this kind of line or string between these diasporic experiences, right? So it becomes, and this might go back to the idea of identity, right? She's saying there isn't a solid identity. Look at all the slippage that's happening here. Look at how we've adapted as a diasporic community, as a peoples.
I'll take that opportunity to cut you guys off for just a second, because we wanted to spend some time at the end scene if our vast, magnificent audience had anything to ask.
They are.
You are magnificent, that wasn't a joke. The vast part was sarcastic. And so, if we were larger, I would sort of moderate more between you, but if you have any questions, actually, I think go ahead and just ask whatever you'd like.
I wouldn't mind, first, if you don't mind me starting off, first I just want to thank the panel. That hour went by very quickly. That was really very enjoyable to listen to. I don't so much as have a question as I just wanted to respond to a couple things very quickly, and then I'll have to make my apologies. I have another meeting, so I don't mean to be offensive, but I'll have to run. But I hope you'll stay and talk for a few more minutes, even though I have to scoot.
I'll lock the doors behind you.
One of the things, and I'm going to speak a little, maybe even sophomorically here, or just overly generalized for a moment, that has always appealed to me about science fiction is that it has its own rather unique but powerful way of dealing with ideas in ways that other genres can't do in quite the same way, which is not to say that the genres can't deal with ideas or that they can't do what they do very powerfully, of course. But there's something that has always appealed to me in science fiction about its ability to grapple with pure ideas, philosophy, concepts in ways that are more direct than perhaps we get in other genres. So, and that goes right to even what Delaney talks about and how to read science fiction, about the literalization of the figurative, of the metaphor, when we're reading science fiction. So we get a literature that allows us to explore the other, the alien, the different in immediate ways in almost every text. I mean, text after text confronts this idea of what is different from us, what's unusual, what's left of center, right of center, in such a plethora of ways that we can't help but be impressed as readers of sci-fi at just how broad all the different answers to these kinds of questions are, that there is not one way that science fiction deals with race, deals with identity, which appeals to me as a reader because you're continually getting new ideas and new perspectives and new ways to think about these age-old, centuries-old human problems. And just so that's just a general statement. And one other just comment before I have to run. one thing that a lot of science fiction authors, and you're going to groan, those of you who know me, but Philip K. Dick does this quite a bit. He's an author of some particular interest to me, is that they have dealt with issues of identity, for instance, in ways so radically different from what we see in mainstream literature that it gets us asking a different set of questions entirely. Instead of just, when you're dealing with a novel of social realism, we're dealing with humanity, right? And its social constructions and how we interact in society and this sort of stuff. But when we are dealing with certain types of science fiction, we're asking the question, what is human? And what Philip K. Dick, for instance, was very emphatic about is that those two are not the same thing. That the biologically human, the member of humanity, is not necessarily very human in a social sense. So he has some wonderful tales where we wind up discovering that the character who has struck us as the most humane, as the most human, is actually an alien, is actually an other, and is not human in a biological sense at all. Which is wonderful and unique and different and gets us thinking about issues of identity construction in ways that approach the topic different from the mainstream novel, I think. Which doesn't even really get to ask the question. It has to start with the assumption that if you're biologically human, you're human.
See, I don't think African American literature does that. That's not the automatic assumption. They're actually more about how, particularly if we're looking at 18th, 19th century, their claim is that white people aren't human. Because if they were human, they could not do this. How could they do this as a human being? So I think that there is that difference, and we're talking like first contact narratives. There's an assumption on both sides that the other person is either a devil or a demon of some sort, right? Equiano was like, they are white devils, right? And we see the same when we look at captain's logs when they enter Africa. Look at those devils, there's black as night. So I think that in that first contact moment, there is a moment where writers are like, and I think throughout the early 19th century, there's no way that they could be human. If they were human, they would not rape our daughters, set us in bondage, because human beings don't do this.
That's precisely Philip K. Dick's point.
So but I think it's in...
That's the point right there. That the case is being made then that there should be there's a natural fit in some ways for African American writers to be able to use science fiction narratives as a way to. And of course they have, right? So we're in agreement on this point,
I think we are.
right? What sci-fi does is it's able to literalize that metaphor.
I think where it breaks down, though, is not necessarily with the writers, but with the publishing world and the social structure we live within, right? Black people don't read science fiction because they're like, that's just what white people do. And particularly, that's what white guys do, right? And particularly, I'm talking about a mid-20th century idea here, right? When you look at Butler, Delaney, they were odd, and they say that. Like, we were odd. I would say I was writing science fiction, and they'd be like, well, that's just stupid.
It's still very prevalent actually today.
And I didn't want to make that claim, but it doesn't seem to have, when I teach Butler, when I teach Hopkinson, my students are blown away.
Yeah.
Right? We were talking today and one of them was like, well, now we read science fiction because we took a class with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, but that's not something that
Right.
seems readily accessible, I think, to black readers.
Well,
for whatever.
There's an analogous, I think it's analogous, although I'm just riffing here a little bit, kind of critical response, again from the mid-20th century, to those critics, actually more 60s and 70s, maybe even bleeding into the 80s than 50s per se. But these critics in the 70s and early 80s who looked at all of the love being given the 19th century American romance writers and saying that was misdirected because those American romance writers before the Civil War were evading questions of real social import through their fantastically tinged narratives, that they were avoiding having to confront real human experience by diverting their attentions into the Gothic and so forth, so they could write about these other things and avoid real problems. I have actually addressed this myself in some of my work, that I think that's a very shallow understanding of what the American Romance writers were doing. That they were hardly socially irresponsible, and that the American Romance tradition was, in its own way, as responsive to the conditions in America and from human to human as any other literary tradition. Just using the Gothic or science fiction or fantasy or the detective novel doesn't make you socially irresponsible. But from a mindset that says, if you delve into those kinds of conventions and forms, you are, in effect, avoiding a certain kind of face-to-face confrontation with real human social problems. If you start with that assumption, then there would be a problem.
But I think that's what makes it so interesting that Baraka in particular is there. But he's had to revise a lot of his Black arts movement rhetoric. Right? He said that Raisin in the Sun was Uncle Tomish and a kitchen table drama. Right? A few years later, he was like, I was wrong. That was not, it was not integrationist. It was not assimilationist. So I think that that's another way in which he revises, right? Because he begins to use science fiction as a way of expanding the conversation rather than seeing it as an escape. So I think African American literature is moving in that direction.
Before you go, I just got to mention I was shamelessly going to use a comparison of Invisible Man and Electric Sheep in my talk about the cyborg.
So like on your point, it's too bad that you're asking, because I think that what you're suggesting is actually something more radical, is that the roots of science fiction might actually be in these contact narratives. If we take science fiction at roots to be questions about humanity, as Dr. Link is mentioning, then those are the questions that informed the Renaissance contact narratives and early African American literature. And so maybe the jumping off point isn't so much science, it's these questions of identity. Now, then we can do a different intellectual tradition and say, well, that's the same time that we had those questions of science coming up.
Well, that would make sense, though, because that was the expansion of the world, right? People began exploring and seeing other places and other peoples.
Mm-hmm.
So I can totally.
And then, people like Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels, the ability to sell that novel as, I actually went to these places.
Yeah.
Because that was originally sold as a travel narrative. And that is, kind of loosely categorized as somewhat science fiction at this point. And so that kind of the empty spaces on the map, in a sense, really kind of facilitated that.
And we can even see this trend, I think, see it again in Charles Johnson's The Middle Passage, which is a neo-slave narrative, but he writes it as captain's logs. Right? Johnny made me think of this. He writes it as captain's logs, and he writes it about an African or a black man from America going back to Africa on a slave ship, essentially. Right? And so it's captain's logs about the destruction of that ship, really, because of their slave, because of the slaves that they took on board. He makes them a magical tribe of peoples who understand God in a complete way, and that these whites are really the fractured beings. Right? And they talk about whites as being uncooked beings. They're not white, they're uncooked.
Not done yet.
They're not done yet, right? And we are clearly done. So I think it's an actually interesting idea. I know you've read some of these first contact narratives, and they're stunningly crazy.
Well, what might be more interesting is that they actually see the work slightly differently, and that the initial contact narratives don't come with that question of humanity. It's an assumption of humanity between, say, Africans and Europeans.
But then,
Americans and Europeans. But then, shortly after the scientific revolution, after we have those kind of institutionalization of the study of race, then we come back to those questions, and the kind of, they're still contact narratives, but they're 100 years later, then they really are deeply interested in this question of humanity. So that would be a different intellectual tradition of science fiction, and it would give it a longer arc, but it would also centralize, I think, this idea of diversity, however we want to define it. It might be a way to think about that.
Well, I'll end up just say that you can see it in some of the stuff that's most traditional canonical science fiction, and you can tell I'm preparing for dissertation, I guess, because H.G. Wells is and to use your phrase, because I think it's way apropos, a lot of his most famous stories are actually contact narratives. Specifically, and I mean, everyone kind of knows it, War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. Even though in The Time Machine, I think you made me think of because, the time traveler goes to the future and he meets the Eloi, who are these like perfect, magical, wonderful people. And he thinks of them as, oh, this is the human race as it will be. And he has no question. He's not uncomfortable with them. Then he meets the Morlocks and they're horrible, and then he goes down into where they live and realizes this is also humanity as it will be. So the book is showing you that the assumption of humanity that you made because of your institutional background can't be true. And the odd thing with The Time Machine is always the beginning. Everyone always goes, well, why is he showing this off at a dinner party? Why isn't he at an exhibition? Well, that's actually really important, right? Because it shows his background. Because he's the kind of upper class, institutionalized, white male British person who would show off a scientific thing at a dinner party first. And that's how they did it. Like they would bring other scientists, other people to their house and give them food and drink first. And I mean, I don't have to explain War of the Worlds.
I'm trying to go through examples in my head that sort of make the connection. I'm thinking the narrative of Abor and Tim.
Oh yeah.
Right? Would be one.
Well, now there's a satire, him, Matt Johnson.
Heard of that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's about a black academic
Oh, wow.
who doesn't get tenure.
God.
Yeah, so the novel thinks, the character in the novel thinks that Pym was a real German. It wasn't fiction.
Which is how it was originally. So,
Right,
perceived.
Yeah.
Well, that's always a post trade, right? This really happened, and I just have manuscripts to read that all the time, yeah. So.
And there's a lot of sort of first contact stuff in old Vigar's Burroughs.
Oh
A lot
yeah.
of it.
That movie's out right now, John Carter. That's his first few Mars novels.
It's a really interesting idea that it just comes right out of that. You sort of really see that kind of stuff. You come up with things.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it even in, like, when science fiction was really, really nascent. Like, Francis Bacon's New Atlantis is basically a first contact, in a sense. And Francis Godwin's Man in the Moon as well, where a man, like, he ropes a bunch of seagulls together to keep silly, and goes, like, travels to the moon and then finds another, race of, I guess, moon people. And what's interesting about them too is that this is, he's a dwarf himself, and he finds that this, like, race of moon people is, their importance is based on their height. So the king or the president, I can't remember exactly what title he had, but was the tallest man there. Like, you could tell how important somebody was. So it was this, like, rampant empiricism. Like, it was really interesting. But it kind of centered around this, like, kind of him sailing to the moon.
That trope shows up again in something a lot more recent. John Vasquez's Shelby Baker's Zen. Is about an alien race trying to conquer the universe, and it's about the one who comes to Earth. Right? And he's completely incompetent. He's also the shortest person. And the leaders are the tallest. That's actually their title. Oh, great tallest. And they're also incompetent, but no one cares. Yeah, so that's actually, I'd forgotten that was in there. But yeah, he's really short, so they just take this kind of goofy little, almost a jester figure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Earth's first representative on the moon is a jester.
Yeah.
Basically.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.